Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I was once lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Who Dat Jedi podcast. And we're coming at it from many different locales tonight in this, the fourth quarantine edition. I don't know which one, but oh well. But we've got Dave Gladow from Town, and we have Alfredo Narvez from Metairie, and I'm in the area of Gentilly. This week, from all the way on the East Coast, is my big brother, and the reason for my Star Wars nerddom, Brian Swoboda. He's from Arlington, Virginia. So everybody say hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, like I said earlier, my wife told me I should wear a mask, so I brought it with me.
Well, unfortunately, this is an audio podcast, so the Vader helmet didn't work there, but that's okay. He put on a Vader helmet that... So I'm 47. Let's see, Brian, I'm going to do the math really quick. You're 51? Going to be 51, right?
No. Oh, that's the nicest thing I've ever said all day. I'm going to be 53, just
okay,
like Herbie.
He didn't give me my math skills. Anyway, it was like 2 years ago, I got him the Vader Hasbro helmet, and everything. So it was... that's what you get your brother who's 50. But anyway, so Brian's going to join us. We're going to ask him about kind of take on everything that has happened since after Return of the Jedi. So that will fill up 2 hours, won't it, guys?
Uh-oh.
Fingers crossed.
But first of all, let's just go around the horn. How are they doing? What are you doing to keep yourself busy? Dave, I mentioned it before. You were doing some very good parenting today.
Yes, I was introducing my son to Donkey Kong, and so I got Nate playing Donkey Kong, and this is making Aaron just beam because this is his favorite game. So
this is the way. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's other than like playing retro video games and trying to not lose my what little hair I have left. That's you're pretty much caught up.
Cool. Fredo, how about you? What's going on in your neck of the woods? That's a nice space. Is that your neighbor?
No, not my neighbor. Might have been Dave's neighbor. No, I'm still working from home, so I'm still kind of having to get up and be somewhat productive and functioning, managing to not just simply veg out. Taking advantage, put a whole bunch of video games from PlayStation because they're having a sale. So got the Spider-Man downloadable pack, watch a whole bunch of Disney Plus, and just trying to fill in the hours in between. Watched Lego Masters yesterday when they had the Star Wars challenge. That was fun.
Oh, I missed that. I need to watch that.
Yeah, it's a really good episode. It's a really good episode. They had the droids there, and they had to build their own droids. And then they had to recreate a battle scene from the saga. So Endor or Hoth or Crate. So, but it was other than that, I mean, just trying to stay sane some kind of way.
Right on. Cool. So Brian, what are you doing to besides work? Because you're working from home. Normally you're working downtown Washington, D.C. What are you doing to keep yourself from going nuts?
Well, we've been having a family get-together every night to watch something on TV, and we've been trying to mix it up a little bit to keep people from getting into a rut and just generally freaking out. And we've had actually some good successes. I went and found on YouTube an episode of a TV show, you may be too young to remember it, Aaron, by Mel Brooks called When Things Were Rotten. It was his Robin Hood pastiche that came out right after Blazing Saddles. And so we watched an episode of that, and that actually went over pretty well. it was kind of surprising. I mean, I realized, a couple months ago just how strong a marriage I had when my wife watched Blazing Saddles for the first time and really, really liked it. So, so I got that going for me. And then we also watched last night, we tried to watch the very first episode I've ever seen of Star Trek The Next Generation. And it was really weird. We watched the premiere, the one with Q, and it was like after 25 minutes, we're not watching this anymore. So we may try again, we may not. That's just the way it is.
It's like the same reaction people have to Tiger King. It's like, what am I watching? So I don't know, Dave. You're smiling ear to ear. Are you a Next Generation fan?
Oh yeah, I watched that all through high school. Love that show. But that first like season or two, you can tell that budget was about $5. It gets better. It gets a lot better.
Well, in the premiere, you could tell there was a lot of Trekkie fan service because it's like Picard, has encountered Q, the weird alien who dresses in medieval clothes and who's threatening to destroy him. He says, "Okay, we're going to detach from the ship," and we're all looking at each other saying, "Why is he doing this? What tactical advantage is there to do this?" And I have to think the only reason they did it is because Star Trek fans had been waiting for 40 years to see the saucer come off the ship.
I'm pretty sure that's accurate. Yeah, I think that's probably why they did that. The saucer comes off?
So now this is a little talk about fan service. This is Aaron's service because, so the people listening, this is pardon us while we divulge while we just self-obsess here for a second. But Dave, your wife Kate will love this part of it because Kate's favorite band, if I'm not incorrect, is REM, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So Brian, do you want to tell us? I didn't set you up for this, but you want to tell us how you have interacted with REM in the past?
Well, yes, there was that one magical day where I was a senior in college at the University of Nebraska in 1989, and if you did put in your time, and like for example, I worked at the Andy Williams Christmas concert, you would get to do something cool. And so what I got to do was to help organize, advance for REM when we came to play at Pershing Auditorium. So my task was to go to Lincoln's finest restaurants, all three of them, and get like menus that you could bring to the band for stuff that they might want to order after the show. And so, I went and did that, and then I was wandering around backstage, and I went into what I was told was Michael Stipe's dressing room, and saw these plants in there and this couch, and only realized like about 10 seconds later there was a guy on the couch, and it was Michael Stipe, and he said hello, and it was kind of weird, but it was really nice. So I went to the show, and I kind of wandered around through the show, and it was all right. And then they brought me backstage afterwards to ask the band, what do you want to eat for dinner? And so they bring me back to Mike Mills, Bill Berry, and Peter Buck, and they say, "Hey, do they still have Runzas here?" And Runza is this fast food that's unique to Nebraska and Kansas. It's this German Russian sort of, it's like a pierogi kind of, where you got meat, inside this baked dough. And I said, "Oh yeah, they got Runzas, they got cheese Runzas, they got Italian Runzas." They said, "Oh, well, here's a $50 bill. Go buy us a dozen Runzas." So I went through the drive-in at the Runza Hut and I bought a dozen Runzas for REM. And they were very appreciative. They said, "Thank you." They were hungry.
So as I remember, that was on the Green Tour, right?
It was.
Yeah, because a guy I was in college with, he was at that concert, and he said it was the best thing because, on the Green album was the most infamous REM song ever, probably "Stand." Michael Stipe gets up to the microphone and says, "This next song sucks. It's called Stand," and then they do Stand. But yeah, so anyway, that was for Kate. So yeah, my brother got to buy Runzas for REM. So yeah,
I will definitely pass that story along.
Well, she doesn't listen to the podcast
most of the time. So what I'm finding out is like she's representative of our audience in that she's not listening as much now that the whole quarantine thing is going on.
Yeah,
so it's like that we've got fewer listeners right now in general. And I think that's a trend related to what we're dealing with. So I think she's one of the listeners that has peeled off for us, unfortunately.
Which, if I'm honest, it kind of surprises me because I've been listening to podcasts nonstop this time. It's because you get tired of watching the news. You don't want to be just vegging on the TV. If I'm cleaning, if I'm cooking, if I'm doing something, I'll just listen to podcasts, whether it's a Saints one or a sports one or a true crime one or whatever. Just it gives you the opportunity for listening to, kind of something that'll be listened to in a normal run of life. But yeah.
Okay, because we're the Who Dat Jedi podcast, so the first part of it is a Saints reference. I have to ask you guys, are we serious? I'm sorry, Brian, I know you're not a Saints fan. We won't hold it against you. But are we seriously shopping around Alvin Kamara? Or is this just people speculating? I've seen like blog after blog is like, here's 5 trade scenarios for Alvin Kamara. I'm like, we would be, Brian, this would be like, I don't know, Nebraska getting rid of Mike Rozier, in the 80s. It was like, oh yeah, let's just send him to Oklahoma. Are we seriously shopping around Alvin Kamara?
He'll be difficult to re-sign, and so that's where the speculation comes in. And it's really up to everybody to kind of take all that with a grain of salt, and how much is real and how much isn't. I think most of it's made up, but it's like he's going to be a hard guy to re-sign because they just paid Thomas all that money.
Yeah, but I think Coach let the cat out of the bag, and he's trying to double back. But it's not. I mean, this is Drew's last year, and so they're gonna have money to play with probably after that. But anyway,
I was gonna say right quick. It's his last year of his contract. We are a couple of weeks away from the draft, so you figure right now, so now everybody's running crazy with 1,000,001 rumors. Just today, former Saints wide receiver Brandon Cooks got traded for the 3rd time to Houston. Yeah. So right now is the time that if you're going to make roster moves for guys who you don't believe you're going to keep, you trade them for draft picks. So in some kind of way, it kind of seems to make sense. But realistically, this is a team that's built to win right now. So you're not going to give them away unless you figure – I'm going to get something similar, but I don't even think the Saints would trade, because all that means is you got to go draft a running back.
Yeah. So, and by the way, if any of you need Nebraska football trivia, my brother is your man. So he is like the Google of Nebraska football. But all right, so every week we do trivia, and so here we go. This is trivia from episodes 1 through 6. So you have to have your prequel knowledge on a little bit. We don't know what the questions are. I just randomly took them out of the Trivial Pursuit DVD box. So this is not a setup. So let's see here. Fredo, I'll start with you, and then you get to tag the next person. All right. So whose last words to Anakin Skywalker are, "Stay in that cockpit"?
Okay, I'm gonna give everybody a moment to think about it, because I'm sure I got the answer already. It's Qui-Gon Jinn.
It is Qui-Gon Jinn. There you go. We need like a ding, 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 something or other. So, all right. So, all right, Fredo, who's next?
Well, let's make it Brian. So, because he's the guest.
All right. To my brother. All right. Who draws the one remaining Imperial scout at the Endor bunker's back entrance into an ambush?
C-3PO.
It's actually Han Solo.
Sorry,
it's all right. We've all gotten ones wrong before.
I'm a big fraud.
No, you're not a big fraud. We've all gotten ones wrong before. as well. And that was a good guess because 3PO was like, "Hey, we're up here," but yeah, it was Han that threw him out. So, all right, Dave, who is Darth Vader talking to on the first Death Star when he observed he is here? Well, you spoke, but you're muted, so that makes for really good podcasting. So,
Grand Moff Tarkin, sorry.
but I read your lips, so you were correct. I saw that. Yes, it is Grand Moff Tarkin, which for probably the first 7 years of my life, or Star Wars life, I thought was Grandma Tarkin, but that's all right. All right, so I'll just pick one randomly off of one of these cards, and it is whose last line aboard the Trade Federation battleship is "Nothing can get through our shield." Oh man.
Oh,
Boy, okay. So it's not going to be Newt Gunray. It's the other one. I think it's Lot Dodd.
Lot Dodd. By the way, do you know how
Oh
Lot
no,
Dodd got his name?
I'm sorry, it's Dultre Dauphins. It was the other one. But go ahead. Yes, I know how Lot Dodd got his name, but you go ahead and tell us.
No, you tell us. You know how did
No,
he get his name?
You're the guest. You tell it.
Well, George Lucas had a fictional universe with a Senate, and he didn't much like one of the Senates that it was modeled on. And the two leaders of the Senate, when Episode 1 came out, were Trent Lott, and actually, Chris Dodd was not a leader of the Senate, but he was a senior senator. And I assume that's how he got it. Lot Dodd.
That's exactly how he got it. Yes. Yep. So, well, that's trivia. So yeah, I got mine wrong. Brian, Swobodas are like, big donuts today. So, but we do have a little bit of news. I did see, I don't know, we reported, it seems like the Rosario Dawson, Ahsoka Tano thing, is going to, seems like, even though it has still not been confirmed by Lucasfilm, it seems like it's getting reported by more and more people that it's a done deal, that she's going to be in. And so, but the big question is now, and it's for multiple episodes. Now, whether that means for multiple episodes of The Mandalorian, or just is she going to get into, her own series, or is it going to be just, does Ahsoka keep popping around? So the question I ask you guys, and Brian, I don't know how much you know about Ahsoka Tano. Have you seen much of the Clone Wars or Rebels or anything?
No, I've seen a couple episodes of Clone Wars, but I'm not as current as you guys are.
All right. Well, she was Anakin Skywalker's Padawan in the Clone Wars. So let me ask you guys this, Dave and Fredo. Then, two questions. This is what I was thinking of before we went on. Is are we going to get too much Ahsoka with Clone Wars, Rebels, Mandalorian, and whatever else she's going to be in? And second question is are they setting up Ahsoka to be this generation's Luke Skywalker? Silence.
No, we're just thinking about it. No, I don't think this be too much because we're expecting that. I mean, right now she's in Clone Wars. That'll be done before the end of summer. So there'll be a break between that and Mandalorian. We're not expecting her to be on every episode of The Mandalorian. We're expected to pop up in a couple of episodes. So she'll pop up here and there until she has her own show. It's, I guess, one thing. And in that way, that might be a good way to build up her character so that people get comfortable who don't know her from Clone Wars or Rebels.
True. Dave, what do you think?
Well, she's still strictly in television, which is still kind of not at the same level of the movies, at least amongst the fandom. So, this generation's Luke Skywalker, that we're way too early to see that, but just because she's not going to be in any movies to our knowledge.
But my point to that is that we grew up with Luke Skywalker was kind of the bright center of the Star Wars universe, right? Is for the younger generation, all those kids who grew up with the Clone Wars, is Ahsoka that focal point now? Anyway.
Well, to a lesser degree, I mean, like she was part of an ensemble. and was never presented as the hero of Clone Wars or Rebels. So she's always been kind of a supporting character, a fan favorite, but never like the star of the show, so to speak. So I think it's it's probably early to say that, but but and I saw at least one report that suggested that she's contracted for multiple series as well as multiple episodes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that she's locked in to doing multiple series, but just that they have the freedom to have her cameo and or star in multiple series at this point.
Sure.
So to me, that indicates that they are planning to expand her role, and I think that's definitely a good bet at this point.
Well, and Fredo, you mentioned it last week. I think the one that a lot of people probably don't see the obvious connection unless you know Ahsoka's backstory, is that she was the original, or she was Fulcrum, but one of the original Fulcrums was Cassian, right? Cassian Andor from Rogue One. So there's, or maybe we see the handing off of the torch or something like that. It would be interesting to find out. But and Brian, I'm going to bring this all back home here in a little bit from conversations we've had and conversations we've had on the podcast. So we'll come back to this here in a little bit. But Fredo, you mentioned you sent us something before we went live. Somebody of importance said something interesting on a podcast.
So, okay, let me see if I can find it. Okay, and this was from the recent Light the Fuse podcast from Cinema Blend. They were interviewing, let me see if I can find Mayor Joe Markey, who's the long-term editor for J.J. Abrams. And of course, the discussion turned to Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi. So they started discussing about if Last Jedi was retconning Episode 7, Force Awakens. So her response was, quoting here from an article over on IndieWire, I couldn't agree more. It's very strange to have the second film so consciously undo the storytelling of the first one. I'm sorry, that's what it felt like. I don't even feel that's true about the third film. It took where the second film ended and just tried to tell a story. I didn't feel like it was consciously trying to undo. It just didn't feel that way to me. End quote. So I think what's interesting is she's saying that she felt, and these are her words, not J.J. Abrams' words, not anybody else was involved with either with Rise of Skywalker's words. She felt that Rian Johnson's Last Jedi was undoing a lot or retconning a lot of what J.J. Abrams had set up in Force Awakens. And then, of course, we've gotten to the idea of, because the charge has been made that Rise of Skywalker was undoing a lot of what Last Jedi did, to which he said, no, that wasn't our plan. Our plan is just tell a story.
This article got me fired up. Can I add like a quote and then my reaction to this? Okay, so
Dave's fired up. Get a beer and sit back. It's gonna be good.
Okay, from the same article, it was hard, I think, for JJ and the co-writer to decide what to do after with it. It's like if someone wrote the middle of your novel, now how do you get the end of the novel? Which pisses me off to no end because he was never going to film the final chapter. He was never slated to do that. And so for them to complain after the fact about the fact that, well, we had this ending in mind, and that, I mean, that's just whether they had an ending in mind or not, it didn't matter because they were never planning to have him come back.
So I'm actually.
We've heard that story.
Go ahead, Brian.
We've heard that story before, though, right? Isn't that George Lucas and Irvin Kershner after The Empire Strikes Back? I mean, he hires Kershner to direct the movie. I mean, by all accounts, I mean, people to this day think Kershner did a great job, but Lucas, for whatever reason, was chomping at the bit, dissatisfied with him, canned him, and then basically, took over Jedi.
My point is, and actually, Dave, you're going to be surprised by this. And because I've said it over a gazillion times that that The Last Jedi painted themselves into a corner. I've likened it to when I would write marching band drill, and it's like, this is a really cool move that I'm having the kids do, and then it's like, oh crap, where do I go from here? You know, and if it's the end of the song, then it's like, hey, great, that's whatever, we'll just end right here. But you know, he wrote a great story, but the person who is not, so there is continuity flaws with this sequel trilogy. That is absolutely, you can't argue against that. There's continuity flaws with this sequel trilogy, but the people who are responsible for it and the people who should be blamed for it is Lucasfilm. It is everybody who writes the checks and who is in charge of the story group and everything like that. That if you're going to do something like this, that if you're going to have, we got 3 movies and we're going to have 3 different directors. That was always the plan. Like you said, we're going to start with JJ and we're going to go, we like Rian Johnson, then it was going to be somebody else. Then they should have had a referee in the room to say, all right, boys and girls, going to write your stories, but we got to make them work. So yeah, this person's writing the middle of your novel, but you got to communicate as to where you envision that going. You know, if you're going to write chapter 2, you have to have a view of what you think chapter 3 is going to be. If you're writing chapter 1, you have to have a view of what chapters 2 and 3 are going to be. So,
Right.
so the people who are trying to blame Rian Johnson tick me off. I think I actually had no problem with the things that he wanted to do, you know, and taking, you know, Star Wars in different directions. You know, I have my qualms with all the movies, but you know, you're right. This is Monday morning quarterbacking, and it actually seems a little. I mean, Brian, you're involved in politics. This seems like, you know, a senator who, like, hey, I really want this opinion out there. Let's find a low-level staffer to go tweet something out so we get my opinion out, and I don't get called on it.
Well, Aaron, I think you raise a good question, which is who's really running the franchise? So I was reading a couple weeks ago Peter Guralnick's book about Elvis, Careless Love, and it talks about the 1968 comeback special, where Colonel Tom Parker wants Elvis to sing like 12 Christmas songs in a tuxedo, but instead they hire Steve Binder to have him do like Elvis in a tight leather suit, singing rock and roll. And it's this struggle all the way through, and Binder ultimately wins. But one thing comes clear from the book, which is that nothing was going to happen on a TV show with Elvis unless Colonel Parker signed off on it. He was basically like running the thing, and he was intimidating everyone else. And so it makes you wonder, is the Star Wars franchise really let's let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's do whatever you want to do sort of thing? Or is there someone who's got their hand on the tiller?
Well, it's what my point earlier of, in the prequel trilogy and in the original trilogy, whether George Lucas was writing the screenplay or directing or not, he was developing the story. So you had one person with this story in mind. And so anyway, but Dave, yeah, I'm right with you that I think this is a sucker punch to Rian Johnson here, and especially when you have, this editor who, I mean, good point. Again, it's like, I think the people to blame are not the director, because somebody wrote his check to write and direct that movie. So anyway.
And I'll also dovetail off of one thing that you said, where it felt like they'd been painted into a corner based on what Rian Johnson had done. I feel the same way in retrospect. Like, if we're playing Monday morning quarterback, I feel the same way about Rian Johnson. I felt like he had been painted into a corner because of the way that Force Awakens unfolded. You've got this, all these mystery boxes that you have to do something with. You have to do something with the Rey-Luke confrontation. You have to figure out a reason for Luke to not be involved in the conflict. You have to do this and that. And it's like, at the time you watch the movie the first time, you're like, my goodness, I didn't expect half of the stuff in this movie. But the more thought you give it, it's like, goodness, could he have done anything else? I mean, like, the places he landed were the most logical. Again, like even the stuff with Rey and what would be her confrontation in the cave. It's like, you're a nobody. and that would be the worst news she could ever get. And I loved it. And again, some of the stuff in that movie took time to adjust to, but you know, I agree with you 1,000% when it comes down to the idea of they should have been given more central
Well,
direction, all of them.
and what's missing, obviously, and I want to see this Comic-Con panel. I want to see J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson on the same stage, and I want the press corps asking them questions. But what's missing is collaboration, because there was, for years, I keep talking about marching band drill. I wrote all those. That's the pictures that a marching band creates on the field, when they're playing the music. And it's not just about making neat pictures. There's decisions you have to make. It's like, okay, the trumpets have the melody, so I need to make sure they're at the front of the field so that that melody gets to the audience. You can't put them backfield, because there's going to be a delay and it's going to be muted and blah, blah, blah. And then you also have to think what's coming up in the next move. So the trumpets may have the melody for measures 1 through 16, but starting in measure 17, the trombones have it. So you have to be setting the trombones up for, putting them in the front of the picture. So there was my last year as a band director, assistant band director, and we shared the drill writing responsibilities. I wrote the first song, he wrote the second song, I wrote the third one. But what we had there was we both had the music, and we both had these things in place where it's like, as long as you are setting up the person who has, the section that has the melody, you can do whatever you want. And you have to know, okay, in the third song, this group has the melody to start off with, so I got to make sure I set them up. There was that collaboration. We had those tools in place. It's not obvious that these tools were in place for these 3 movies. Sorry, I
No,
just went on a long
no,
tangent. Fredo?
no, that's fine. And actually, that makes a really good point, and that goes to what Dave was saying. In some ways, she's taking it personally on behalf of JJ, because they're the ones getting all the heat for the way that Rise of Skywalker turned out in the eyes of some. But that wasn't the original plan. The original plan was for JJ to do what he does best: the setup, the build up, all the mystery boxes, hand that off to Rian Johnson to give you an emotional center, and then give it to Colin Trevorrow to give you the big bombastic finish, which is really what he does best. It didn't happen for whatever reasons happened between Lucasfilm and Trevorrow, and they had to scramble and get Abrams back in. Now, that normally, if you've ever seen any J.J. Abrams production, you know that the thing that he has issues with is the endings. He's good at the setups, he's bad at the endings. So in some ways, they got themselves up in a situation which probably, somebody tells you, do you want to direct a Star Wars movie? You're always going to say yes, because you only get so many of those. Those don't come along but once or twice in your lifetime, so you do it. But at the same time, it put them in a bind, because now they had to reconcile what they had done with what Rian Johnson had done, without having talked to one another beyond the bare basics. And it comes through in the movie. You can totally tell that he's trying to now fit what Rian Johnson did and what he had set up in a way that can come up to a satisfying conclusion. And they clearly did not talk to one another.
So anyway, that's us. We'll come back to the Rise of Skywalker, because Brian's going to be part of what we're pinning you down on. And by the way, another part of the podcast tonight is we're going to have our first not really episode, but our first installment of crud that Aaron should have been seeing and hasn't. So we're going to I've watched a couple movies that apparently my life has been deprived of enrichment because I haven't. So, and we're going to let you guys quiz me and everything like that. But I want to go to my big brother here, because he is the reason he's the reason for a lot of the things that I am. But the big thing is Star Wars. So Brian, you want to kind of talk about your Star Wars? We taught everybody that's been on our podcast before. What's your Star Wars story? Why did it speak to you? Go back to 77 when we were kids, and going through your adult life. Why has it stuck with you? Go ahead. Just let you ramble
Well,
for a while.
Well, you said 1977, and I think that's the important thing, which is Generation X has like only one thing going for it, which was I was a 10-year-old boy when Star Wars came into the theaters for the first time, and everybody saw it fresh. No one knew anything about it. No one had any expectations about it. No one knew who any of the characters were. It was just a movie you were going to go see. So when 10-year-old Brian went to see Star Wars in West Lafayette, Indiana, in June of 1977, it was like the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my life. I ran home with my friend John Cole. We went to his basement. We got a refrigerator box, that his parents had left aside because they bought a new fridge, and we turned it into an X-Wing fighter, and we played battles in his basement. It was just such a cool movie. And it was because it was fresh and it was unexpected and it all hung together and it all made sense. And there was no expectation you had of it going in either. I mean, that's one of the problems I think with all of the subsequent movies, because every one of them has had to live, under, or has had to carry that anchor, which is how do you approach and enjoy the movie with the baggage of the expectations that you bring to it. And that for me has been one of the problems with all of the Star Wars movies, ever since, which is just I actually don't think it's possible to make a movie that will make me feel as excited and surprised as I was as a 10-year-old boy in 1977. And it's not the fault, of George Lucas, Ryan Johnson, or any or J.J. Abrams or anybody else. It's just I'm not 10 years old anymore. And I'll never be that person seeing that movie in that way, ever again. And so that's kind of what said it for me. And when have I had experiences like that since? A couple years later, when 12-year-old Brian saw Superman the movie at the Cooper Theater in Lincoln, Nebraska. To be honest, Darren, I had it a little bit with Iron Man, where you had a story that was just, I mean, it was a familiar story, but it was told in a fresh way. I had no expectations of what the movie was going to be like. It was just a pleasant surprise, and it was tight. That was the other thing about Star Wars too, which is that it was tight. There was not a moment where it seemed it was too long or too boring. It was almost, I think, like 2 hours on the nose, maybe slightly over, but there wasn't like a minute of fat in the entire movie. And that sort of economy, telling a story, that was tight and made sense, was part of what made the movie so appealing. A couple things about Star Wars I remember seeing at first. One of the things I've noticed about the movie since is, maybe it's because I'm getting old and mentally decrepit. I have trouble remembering the names of the characters in the movies I go to see now. If you asked me, for example, in The Rise of Skywalker, to name 15 of the characters, I'd be lucky if I could probably rattle off 5 or 6. And part of it, I think, is the way in which Star Wars was written. Because if you look at the screenplay and you look at the movie, I mean, it's written away basically to indoctrinate you. Aunt Beru out there in the dark calling, Luke, Luke, I'm coming, Aunt Beru. I mean, everybody's saying everybody else's names like 9 times for no apparent reason. And I never noticed that until like, actually just some months ago. But that's storytelling, right? It's not particularly subtle storytelling, but it was like you felt like you knew who each of these characters, were, and they had sort of a lasting impact on you. One last thing about Star Wars 2 that I think maybe is different, than, some of the other movies that's followed it is, again, that sort of economy of storytelling. I mean, you had, for example, in the climactic battle scene on the Death Star, you had just the one thing. It was the X-Wing fighters going into the trench to try to blow up the Death Star. It was just one thing, and that was all that it was about. And then you saw that metastasize over the rest of the movie. So in Empire Strikes Back, it was Luke dueling Darth Vader while Leia and Han are trying to escape, or while Leia and Chewie and Lando are trying to escape off of Bespin. In Return of the Jedi, it's Luke and Vader, dueling while they're trying to shut down, the shield, on Endor. And then you see the same thing. It's like you have to have 3 things going on simultaneously. And again, I'm kind of old, but it's like overload. You lose the economy of the story. But that's a rambling answer to a simple question. But I'll never see. I'm just a different person I was before, and I'll never see a movie again that was like seeing Star Wars when I was 10.
I'm really curious, like, what was your reaction to Empire Strikes Back that you recall? Because those are the
Um,
two movies that everybody holds up on the pedestal to this day.
Um, I liked Empire Strikes Back, but in a way it was unsatisfying. It was a purposefully dark movie. I mean, from the moment when they're on Hoth, for example, there's sort of, I mean, literally a coldness and a distance from what's going on, and sort of it begins with conflict among the characters, among Luke, Leia, and Han. That's pretty serious. And then, of course, the ending was unsatisfying. You left at a point where you were unsatisfied by what had happened and didn't really know what was going to happen next. Not in a way when you were like you were angry about it when you left the theater. I wasn't. I thought it was a good movie, but it was definitely different in kind than Star Wars. And for a 12-year-old, or a 13-year-old, I mean that wasn't completely satisfying. There's a part of me that bridles a little bit at the idea that The Empire Strikes Back is like Citizen Kane, and Star Wars is like, Steamboat Willie. I kind of don't buy into that.
Were you after Empire? Were you like Homer Simpson leaving the theater, going, "I can't believe that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father"?
No, but that same summer I saw Rocky 2, and we were waiting in line outside the theater, and some guy turns behind us and says, he loses, don't you? And I was like, dude, why are you doing this? He says, no, it's okay, he wins. It's like, dude, you just made it worse.
Right.
That's awesome. So
That should be a crime.
however, okay, so you said you're just, you talked about Empire Strikes Back. Here's another trivia question. I bet I can guess. I'll let you state it, but what is your favorite Star Wars action figure that you ever got?
Uh, oh boy. Um, I think I mean, first off, you remember how it rolled in our family, right? I got Darth Vader. I think Wendy got Han Solo, and you
No,
got
I
Luke
got Han.
Skywalker,
No, I
right?
got Han. Wendy got Luke. That was and no, I got Han and Wendy got Luke. And by the way, do you remember where we got those?
We got those in Goodland, Kansas.
At the Alco in Goodland, Kansas. See, guys, I remember this stuff. See, he's the eidetic memory here. But no, I'm gonna guess. I think the one you're really pumped about is your Yoda action figure.
Oh yes, thank you for the mental prompt. I have the Yoda with like the snake and the stick, and it's like a really really cool toy with like the little felt cloak. It was an awesome toy.
So anyway, um, but so I guess so we all get older. Well, okay, let's not get
Too old.
philosophical here. Let's not get philosophical. Let's go after Jedi, because I will tell. I've told this story before on the podcast, and I'll just say it out loud now. My favorite thing was when you called me after seeing Solo, and you said, "How is Darth Maul alive? He was cut in half." And you like embodied everything that I've argued that I think is quote unquote wrong. It's a fault in the system here, is that it seems like you have to do the summer reading in order to really appreciate some of these new movies. So you were the embodiment of that, because all of a sudden you're like, how is Darth Maul alive? Because it's like he was cut in half the last time I saw him, and then all of a sudden here he is in Solo. So I guess we'll start. That's the story I want to tell. But talk to me about, starting with Rogue One and going through the sequel trilogy. Just what you thought of. You've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but what are your likes, dislikes, things like that? Questions of this new stuff.
Well, I mean, first off, I liked Rogue One, I think, better than the other post Jedi movies, because there was a freshness to it. There was an unpredictability to it. I mean, none of the characters really had any sort of relationship to anything I had seen or thought
I'm gonna stop
before.
you there for a
There were
second.
some who,
Pause. Was there really a freshness to it?
well, yeah, I mean, like the way they treated the Force in Rogue One was completely different than how they treated the Force in the prequel trilogies. for example. I mean, there was a real mystery to it, like that the blind guy from the Church of the Jedi, who's saying, I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me. I mean, that was interesting. I mean, that was maybe the most interesting character I'd seen in a Star Wars movie since Jabba the Hutt.
Wow. But no, I guess I was.
I mean, big
Yeah.
Jabba. Like let's go and have another big gulp Jabba.
I was just being, I was
But
being a little bit of a butthead because Rogue One had Death Star and Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin and people that look like the things that we grew up on. But anyway, I love the movie as well. But keep going, Dave. You were going to say something.
There were so many original characters. I kind of understand what Brian's saying there, because you don't know what's going to happen to any of them. Whereas if you watch like a Solo prequel, Solo and Chewie are making it out of that thing alive. And I think that's kind of what he was getting at.
Yeah, and also there was a mystery to the characters. One of the things about Rogue One, I didn't like, was the protagonist's history with her father, for example. I mean, it's one of the things about the Star Wars movies, sort of the outgrowth of Darth Vader being Luke's father, that's happened, which is you're wondering like about who everybody's family tree is. And when you saw Star Wars, nobody had anything to do with anybody except that Ben Kenobi had once trained Darth Vader and had known Luke's father. I mean, none of these people had anything to do with anybody, and you didn't know, and you kind of didn't care because they were interesting on their own terms, And it's sort of like letting them have a bit of mystery. It gives some air to the story that makes it in a funny way, more accessible. I mean, like you were talking earlier about Rey, and the corner she got written into in The Last Jedi. I mean, I actually thought very strongly that Rey should have turned out, to be nothing. If I'd plotted like the last trilogy, for example, it basically would have been like like a snark take, on the prequel trilogy, which is when you went through the prequels and you introduced the concept of midichlorians and people having a high midichlorian count. You did a couple things. The first was you demystified the Force. You turned it into something that was scientific. And the second thing was, you created the possibility for sort of a master race, right? I mean, you have the Skywalkers who've got midichlorian counts that go off the charts, and then you got all the rest of the schlubs in the world who are never going to amount to anything. So, you put one of them in charge, guess what's going to happen? Well, bad things are going to happen. And so that's the way I would have plotted, the trilogy, which is, good news and bad news. The good news is Ren Solo's, daughter, the son of Leia, and has one of the highest midichlorian counts in the world. The bad news is he's a bad guy, so he becomes like little Hitler. He gets taken up on the idea that I'm going to run the universe with my high midichlorian count, and I'm going to round up everybody else and put them into camps. And you could have taken the First Order, who were sort of like crypto Nazis, and they could have worked for him and been basically real Nazis, because that would have been, the same idea. And then, comes Rey. But what would have been really interesting is if Rey had had these Force powers and no one knew how. She was just special and she didn't know how. She didn't have a special father. She didn't have a special mother. She just came out of nowhere. And so you could have made, the trilogy sort of about the rebellion against, these crypto Nazis, and, the fact that these people, were just ordinary. They weren't special. They just happened, to come from different places and take it out. You could have restored mystery and democracy to the Force. That's how I would have written it.
Well, there you go. Jeez, man.
No, but Aaron, Brian makes a rather good point regarding scripting and the ideas of what Star Wars tries to get at. I mean, a lot of this is playing off old myths and old tropes. Everything from the damsel in distress, who is the rogue with the heart of gold, who is Han Solo, the up and coming knight who comes out of nowhere. So a lot of this is already baked into it. So what you don't want to do, and sometimes it's difficult, is you don't want to become kind of a treatise on itself, but you also have to find new ways to kind of tell the story. And sometimes the hardest part to do is to acknowledge that that you're almost kind of repeating yourself. Which, I mean, don't get me wrong, like some of the Force Awakens worked so well because it did repeat a lot of the beats that we're familiar with, which is why I ended up liking Last Jedi so much, because it didn't. It took it in new ways, and that's kind of what we were hoping that this trilogy would kind of go off on. But you know, it is what it is at this point.
So Brian, what did you think of? I mean, like I said, I told that story about Maul, but what did you think about Solo?
Solo.
I liked Solo more, I think, than most people did. And I liked it especially well until like the very end. You know, when I was like Darth Vader at the end of episode 3. No! I mean, it hung together, you know, fairly well. I liked, you know, Solo. I thought he was an appealing character. And I liked the plot. And I liked, you know, the way, and I liked the sort of, you know, way it turned inside out, you know, at the end of the movie. But then I thought, you know, the drop in, you know, of Darth Maul was just it was a curveball too far. That was my view.
Well, again, it was, you know, one of those things. I've made the argument that it's like you had to do the summer reading. If you hadn't seen Clone War, if you'd seen Clone Wars, which I had, because I mentioned it many times on this podcast. I remember I was binge watching the Clone Wars on Netflix a couple of years ago, and got to the episode, and I remember Brittany woke up and she came out and said, "Oh, so how's the Clone Wars?" I said, "Fine, but Darth Maul is a spider now," and she's like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah." so, so yeah, there was a lot of people, but I mean, again, we've talked about all this stuff ad nauseum. That I don't think it's kind of like, well, so let's get to the Mandalorian. You know, the end of the Mandalorian, when first season, spoiler alert, when um, Moff Gideon has the dark saber, it doesn't ruin the 7 or 8 episodes that led up to that, because you didn't do the summer reading, right? I think sometimes you can have those deep cuts that people are like, you know, get kind of nerded out over, but the story is unaffected. But I think with Solo, that was a deep cut that it just ended up being confusing. Anyway, that's my take.
No, particularly as it comes out of the blue and this is one of the difficulties, like you're saying, with that not doing the summer reading. Whenever you're crafting, say, something like a TV show, you can kind of figure that the people watching the TV show will have some idea of the movies. You can't do the reverse. You can't craft the movies thinking people have seen the TV shows. You have to let them be separate, and then, you know, if you're going to introduce information, it has to be something that's not going to be that much shocking to them. So I guess that was the problem, is they didn't realize that until that point.
So Brian, what'd you think of the Mandalorian then?
Oh, I thought The Mandalorian was the best Star Wars content I've seen since 1983. I loved it. And part of it was because of that sense of mystery. I mean, it had air to it. You didn't know the background of all the people. You didn't know, you didn't know the whole story of the universe in which he was in, and that made it mysterious and interesting and inviting. And I like that. And the other thing too I liked about The Mandalorian, it goes, to it goes to what we're saying earlier. I mean, it's like I saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, last year, and The Mandalorian reminded me, reminded me of Brad Pitt as Cliff Booth. I mean, this, just sort of badass, who goes doing cowboy stuff, only he's wearing armor and, interacting with aliens. But it's very much like an old Western, and that gave the story its sort of simplicity and resonance.
Was it, did you think it was too fan servicey, just enough fan servicey, or not enough fan servicey?
I think Alfredo was right. It was, it was fan servicey, but in a way that wasn't distracting. It did that sort of stuff, and I would compare it to, like, I'm watching Better Call Saul now, the Breaking Bad spinoff, and there's a lot of fan service in Better Call Saul. They drop Easter eggs and things that have, reminders of Breaking Bad, but they do it, in a very subtle way where you got to look for it, you got to know about it. I mean, they call them Easter eggs for a reason, because you got to go in your backyard and you got to hunt for them, But like at the end of Solo, for example, it's like somebody's taking an egg and crashing it in your face.
Obviously, Brian has some strong feelings about Solo. So, well, cool. Yeah, I don't know. That's it's a lot of good perspectives on that. You got me thinking now about. You're right about, especially in New Hope, how I've never thought about that, the ending where it's just dealing with the one thing. Whereas now it's like every movie, it seems like you have to have, the three storylines converging. I don't know, guys. Had Fredo, Dave, have you
Hmm.
noticed that before with those?
Oh
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
No.
And Lucas did that in Return. Well, I mean, like as Brian pointed out, and at the end of Empire, you got two different things. At the end of Return, you got three different things going on, and then Phantom Menace, I think he goes up to four. And that was a very deliberate thing by Lucas. You could tell. He just kept pushing the envelope a little bit further so that that end sequence could get bigger and crazier and more
And I was,
complex.
yeah, I was just gonna say I was actually watching somebody's critique of the last Harry Potter movie, not in that series, but the last Fantastic Beasts movie, and they were saying there was all these characters, but there was no central line, and I think that's the difference between making a good movie and a bad movie. You can have all those elements kind of converging, but you have to have one central story, one lead character, or a couple of lead characters that you're gonna follow their story through. Otherwise, it can just become a lot of side plots that never quite come together. And I think that's something that I think, thank goodness, whether it was the prequels with Anakin and Obi-Wan or whether it was in the sequels with Rey and Finn, and they always make sure that you knew this is their story and we're going to follow them. And then we'll also tell you a bit about Kylo Ren, or we'll tell you off over here a little something about what Poe's doing. But by and large, this is their story, because otherwise you need to give that audience that anchor or that element that they're going to latch onto. Because if they don't have somebody that's going to be the character they're going to follow, it can be quite easy to get lost in all the spectacle.
It's like different flavors of ice cream,
Mm-hmm.
Like the A New Hope again, it's more direct and it's just I mean, I love it to death. But then you look at something like Phantom Menace, and to Alfredo's point, it works because you have that central conflict of the Jedi versus Maul, and you're just enraptured by that conflict, and it just kind of grounds everything else. And so I think, like, again, it's two different approaches, but I like them both. I like A New Hope better, but
Mm-hmm.
So before we move on to our, you guys get to pick on me about the movies that I watched. Brian, I want to see if you remember, because I've told this story before as well. Just you got to make sure that do you remember the first, and I'm using air quotes on a podcast, but Star Wars convention that you took me and Ed Muller to?
Yeah, it was at the Bennett Martin Public Library in Lincoln, Nebraska, in
Yes,
like
sir.
1982, and they had the screenplay for Revenge of the Jedi there, if memory serves, before it had come out. And it was
I don't
and
remember
that was
that
also
part. I
where I
remember
saw
seeing the trailer, but anyway, go ahead.
I also saw Hardware Wars there for the first time.
Yeah, and it was funny because Fredo and I were the two of us, and Brittany went to a pizza place in Kenner, suburb of New Orleans, and they had Star Wars trivia night. And one of the questions was, "What is the number of the trash compactor in A New Hope?" And quickly wrote it down and handed it in. It was 3263827. And the person, the trivia jockey, afterwards came up and said, "How did you know that?" I was like, "Because first of all, I was like, doesn't everybody know that?" But anyway, no, I remember I was like, I went to this Star Wars convention in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I remember they had Star Wars trivia. And Ed and I were sitting there, and that was one of the questions: "What's the number of the trash compactor?" And everybody shouted it out at once. And Ed and I looked at each other like, "Who are these nerds?" Only to
Well, There's one thing that pisses me off about living in Nebraska and being a Star Wars fan with the benefit of hindsight, which is that in the 1980s, you and I missed out on like a life-changing opportunity. Did you ever hear the story about the guy who bought the Death Star?
Maybe.
He's driving in Missouri and he's in the Lake of the Ozarks and he goes to a flea market. And in this flea market, there's the Death Star. It's the model, like about 5 feet in diameter. That was the model that was used in A New Hope. And basically, what happened was somebody from ILM like moved from California to Missouri. They brought the Death Star with them, and there it was at this flea market in the Lake of the Ozarks. And so for $300, he buys the Death Star, and now he's got it in like his living room in a glass case. By the way, imagine that fight with your wife. You know, honey,
That wouldn't
I
have been
just
a
bought
fight.
the Death
No.
Star, and we're going to put it right in the front foyer so everybody can see it right when they come in the house. You know, it's like a Christmas story and the lamp with the leg. You know, only
No,
it's
that
the
wouldn't
Death
have been
Star.
that wouldn't have been a fight in my household. She would have been all on board. So,
Oh,
but
in my house, that Death Star would have ended up in the attic. But yeah, I imagine like you and me and Dad, you know, there, and we're trying to get Dad to loan us the $300 to buy the Death Star, and then you know he coughs up, and then we tie it to the luggage rack of the Gran Torino station wagon, and we're driving down Interstate 70 with the Death Star on top of this station wagon.
Holiday Road. Uh, oh yeah, cool. Well, thank you for your Star Wars insights. With you said a lot of things we haven't talked about. It made me think even more about these movies. So I appreciate that. But one of the things we talked about when we formed this podcast, because we started this podcast when Disney Plus was coming out, and it's just something for us to do. Disney Plus would have good fodder for us to talk about, and it's been Star Wars and Star Wars. But we kicked around this. We started conversations about, hey, you know this movie, and I'm like, I haven't seen that movie. And then Dave and Fredo would be like, you haven't seen that movie? And it's like, so we're developing this list, and one of them, I mean, I've only seen maybe 3 of the Marvel movies. I saw Captain Marvel, I saw Black Panther, and I saw Guardians of the Galaxy 1. I mean, I'm if you ask me if I'm a DC or Marvel guy, I mean, I probably have seen more DC movies, but I don't live in a certain camp. But so decided, well, hey, let's have Aaron start watching some Marvel movies, and we can pick on him about it, And I'm expecting you guys to ask questions and such, but I have to read this conversation, and I'm doing this because I know Dave's going to lead in our podcast with my rendition of. I was on Twitter the other day, and I pointed out to somebody that you can sing "Amazing Grace" to the tune of Gilligan's Island, and they said I can't quite get it into their head, and so they said maybe Aaron will serenade me the next time we see each other after this quarantine, and so I turned on the video on my camera, picked up my ukulele, and started singing and playing it. So that's going to lead in this podcast.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I was once lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
McClunky.
But anyway, before that, I have to say this because I was making fun of Fredo and Dave because what they said, they both agreed that Iron Man should be the first one that I watch.
The truth is, I am Iron Man.
So I was like, you know what? It's kind of funny. And that's why one of the reasons why I invited you on the podcast, Brian, was because you bought me Iron Man for Christmas or my birthday several years ago. By the way, guys, I have to say, Mother is the most thoughtful gift giver that I've ever known. And that's saying something because my wife gave me a lightsaber replica on our first anniversary. But my brother is like, it's not like he takes a list and he gets you what's on your list. He like thinks about who you are and what your interests are. And based on those interests, I think Aaron would like this. And so I'd never had one interest in seeing Iron Man, and he sends me Iron Man. So so it's actually kind of sat there in the DVD cabinet. I hadn't seen Iron Man, so when I told him that we're doing this podcast, he's like, "You haven't seen Iron Man?" So he's with you. So you guys are going to be able to quiz me. But I sent this. This was in our Twitter conversation between the three of us. I said my homework is done. If you all want me to bang out 2 movies before Thursday, that's more than possible. So I actually have watched Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2. But before we can get to Iron Man 2, here's what's transpired. Fredo, Dave, should it be Iron Man or Thor? Dave, I think Iron Man 2 might be fun just to get an unfiltered view of that one too. Fredo, that could work, especially since Iron Man 2 tends to be the redheaded stepchild of that trilogy. Hush, no, it's super well regarded. Fredo, oh, I mean in comparison to Iron Man 1 and 3. Dave, I was just trying to not to color Aaron's thinking. Dave, I suppose that's the question at this point. Is he interested enough to want to go for broke and do everything, or would he rather skip some stuff? To which Fredo then says, what do you think of this, Dave? And it's a list of all the Marvel movies in some order that I can't believe you took the time to write this out. But anyway, I won't read all those. So then it gets to Dave. Well, that's pretty good, though it might be fun to takes on the whole as it unfolds. I guess I'll wait on Aaron's feedback, whether, yeah, he keeps wanting my feedback, but and I replied then finally said, apparently there's no proper watching order. I don't care, guys. Just let me know. Though I'm going to read this entire conversation between on the next podcast. And then I had the gif of Ogre from Revenge of the Nerds just going, nerds. So these two guys were arguing about what is the, I mean, if you talk to 2 Star Wars fans, it's like going, you're going to, either it's going to be the machete order or it's going to be, you know, in chronological order. Well, apparently there are some things here. So apparently you got some baggage. So with that, I will just say that I have watched Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2, and now I'll let you guys take it from here. You can ask me questions. You can, whatever. Fredo, you want to say something?
Now, I was just going to say right quick, the whole reason why that is because similar in nature to the Clone Wars, you know, we recognize it's 6 seasons, not 7. So telling somebody, okay, start from episode 1 and binge through them, well, it might give you a bit of a while for to catch up to it. So we're kind of chopping it up to just be the essential parts. It's 23 movies, so we're like, okay, maybe take a bit of pity on him, kind of help him. But you said you wanted to do it all, so we're going to do it all.
Hey, the governor's locked me down. What am I going to do? So
you got
Aaron,
time,
I'm curious.
sir.
Did you like? Oh, go ahead, Dave. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying he's got time to do it because that Black Widow movie has been postponed. So
In November,
Yeah.
right? So
yeah,
Well, Aaron, I'm curious. Did you like Iron Man 2?
Iron Man 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was fine. And I think that's what I'd say with Iron Man 2, that it was fine. Iron Man 1, Brittany and I really enjoyed it. It was fun. You know, it was, I will say that, and this is what I don't know. You guys are going to have to help me. Which came first, Batman or Iron Man?
Batman.
Okay, because, I mean, it's like we both looked at each other. It's like, okay, so this is Marvel's Batman. I mean, you've got, you know, I mean, with yes, there's personality differences, but in essence, you have a really rich guy who is good with technology and has, you know, one has Alfred, the other one, and Fox, the other one has this, you know, has Jarvis,
Yeah.
Jarvis, you know. So anyway, I mean, there's obvious similarities between. You could tell that the competition between Marvel and DC. You know that, okay, they've got their thing, we've got to have our version of that. You could tell that.
What's interesting is Batman was created in 1928. Iron Man didn't come into the scene until 1963 or 64, thereabouts. And basically, it's just Stan Lee decided and Jack Kirby decided to just simply, okay, combine Howard Hughes type character with a gallant knight and just kind of put it together and do a 60s version of all that. So yeah.
But no, we really enjoyed Iron Man 1. It was a fun movie. You know, I am a Robert Downey Jr. fan, but Tony Stark reminded me a lot of his character, of Robert Downey Jr.'s character in Back to School. You know, I mean, it seemed like that dude grown up, it was the same guy, just with a lot more money. You know, it's like he inherited Thornton Mellon's money.
Wait till you watch Civil War.
It
Yeah.
was so it was um, the thing. If there was any annoying factor, there's two annoying factors that I had. One is throughout the entire movie, Pepper Potts is this strong, really kind of, just a really strong force. And then at the end of the movie, she's she's the 80s slasher film girl who's running in high heels from Jason, and just like, it's like she can't help herself, type of thing. It just, that drives me crazy. The other thing is, and this kind of reminded me, Brian, when we talked, I think one time about one of the Superman movies, the new Superman movies, not the old Christopher Reeve one. But it's like anytime any of the movies, whether it's DC or Marvel, we get into the fight scene, that's where I get taken out of a movie because everything else seems legit, and then once you get into the fight scene, it becomes a mixture of Transformers and The Matrix, and the special effects become very obvious. And so the fight scene takes me out, but then it's like we're sitting there going, man, this is what the conversation, Brian, that we had one time. It's like, how is like everybody's insurance rates not through the roof because of all the damage that these people do to the community at large when they are fighting?
Oh yeah.
This is why you got to have a secret identity. That way they can't send the bill.
But that was the thing that I found interesting. What this is like, what the only superhero movie probably where there's no secret identity really.
Mhm.
He's at the end. He's like, I am Iron Man. So I find that very interesting. So let me then shift when we got to Iron Man 2. Brian, you asked, did I like Iron Man 2? Yeah, we liked it all right. But again, we were about halfway through and we looked at each other and was like, it's basically the same plot points, just different people. And so again, it's kind of like I always think about when we talked about the Mandalorian episodes and we talk about, the movies, what is the, because people talk about filler episodes. And it's like I'm always thinking about what is the purpose of this slow moving episode in moving the story forward. And that was not necessarily clear in Iron Man 2. Yeah, okay, Tony Stark he was all pro weapon and full of himself, and then he sees, listens to the better angels, and he's like, I'm not going to, make weapons anymore, I'm a better guy. And then he becomes all full of himself because he's brought peace to the world. So he's swung the pendulum all the way to the other side and has to center himself again. That's pretty much what Iron Man 2 seemed to be. Maybe that's just too entry, but again, it was fun. It was you know Pepper Potts again was running around like the slashers 80s woman again at the end. Jon Favreau, I never forget, you guys have seen the Family Guy Empire Strikes Back parody. And the guy who's, that they take in Family Guy, the movie, the video movie, the guy who's really, he's at the convenience store and he's really into videos. And he's talking, so he's Yoda, and Yoda's talking about Iron Man. And he says, yeah, Jon Favreau is a really good director. He puts himself in all of his movies, but he's a really good dude. And that was the thing that kind of took me out, is that Jon Favreau had more of, is like, I'm going to give myself more gags in this movie. And that was clear in Iron Man 2. But, other than that, it was, it was fine,
Well, I'll say two things about Iron Man 1. I really, really enjoy the flying sequences. Because I feel like we talked about pacing when it came to A New Hope earlier, and um, I just think like a lot of the times, and this kind of goes to your point, Aaron, with the special effects scenes and the battle scenes, and it doesn't feel real or weighty. Um, I love the flying sequences because it's like, let's take a moment to just kind of recreate what this would feel like for a real person. The awe that it would inspire in a person to actually be able to just fly around in a metal suit. Um, I just adore that sequence because when he's building his suit, obviously, is really cool. But then when he's finally taking it out for a test flight, it's a lesser movie wouldn't have given us that scene and wouldn't have given us the time for it.
I will say this. I think it's very interesting, and it's actually to the point of, oh crap, Fury's comment at the end of Iron Man 2, when Nick Fury said, well, it's going through Black Widow's um, personality, file on Tony Stark. And he's narcissistic and everything like that. Britt and I were talking about at the end of Iron Man 2. I said, you know what? Imagine if you went to a Superman movie and for about 3/4 of that movie you saw nothing but Clark Kent, or if you went to a Batman movie and for 3/4 of that movie you saw nothing but Bruce Wayne, you'd probably be a little ticked off.
Yeah.
But
Well,
for some reason, go ahead, Brian.
that was Superman the movie. I mean, you spend a whole hour in Krypton and in Kansas and with Clark Kent in Metropolis until you see anybody in a blue suit, except for like 30 seconds in the Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah, and the same thing happened with the Dark Knight Rises, where the first hour and change is Bruce Wayne all being decrepit, hideaway recluse until he puts on the bat suit about an hour or so in.
Yeah,
But yeah,
you had 2 movies before that of a heck of a lot of Batman. So you can
Sure.
kind of do a little bit of that, but
Mhm.
I thought it was very interesting.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously the story is more about Tony Stark than it is about Iron Man. But
Well,
yeah, go
let
ahead.
me ask you. No, let me ask you this, then, Aaron, because it's an interesting point you make. Because that was what everybody recognized back when Iron Man came out in 2008. How well, or how much did you enjoy Iron Man and Iron Man 2 just hanging around with Tony Stark, with that character?
Well, see, that's the thing, is that if you end up having it be 3/4 of the movie Iron Man, then it becomes, like I said, the Transformers movie where you're just gonna be fighting everybody all the time, and it's just you're gonna lose the story. So, and I think that is obviously with any of these superhero movies, is that the more interesting thing is the person, not the costume. It's what it's that personal development, what they're actually trying to maybe compensate for is not the right word, but it's why is this why are they the way they are, and how does the superhero part of it contrast to that. So um I will say Iron Man 2 was just, I mean, when he was drunk at his party, that was just like, that was dumb, and but anyway, so I didn't
Well,
dislike it, but Iron Man 1 better than Iron Man 2, I will say that.
Marvel had. Go
I
ahead.
like Sam Rockwell in Iron Man 2.
Yes.
Oh,
when
yeah.
he's dancing to pick up the pieces at the Stark Expo.
Yep. That's awesome. And actually, Sam Rockwell always seemed like a perfect foil for Robert Downey Jr. and Iron Man 2 in terms of personality, because you almost get the sense that he's trying to be Tony Stark, but just doesn't quite get it. you know, where it's interactions with Rhodey when they're, when he's displaying all the, I don't know, all the hardware for the War Machine suit, whether it's when he's doing his presentations, he's really trying to come off and give off this cool guy vibe, and it doesn't never seem to be working for him.
I will
Yeah.
say this, is that they should have either had Mickey Rourke or um,
Sam Rockwell.
Sam Rockwell. They should have had either one of those two as the antagonist, not try to tag team it, because both were then sold short. They're competing for bad guy screen time.
Mhm.
Really throughout most of the movie, I was just like, okay, I get why Mickey Rourke's character is here, but I don't get why he's here, because he's not really being utilized, you know, except he wants his bird. So,
Well, a really common theme in the Iron Man series is this idea of regret. And we've talked about that some when we've talked about the sequel trilogy of Star Wars, and just this idea of the sins of the father, and having to deal with not only what your ancestors have left you, but what your own mistakes have wrought. And that's a really common theme in comic books in general. But in the Iron Man movies, especially, it's a really major theme. So get used to it, because in Iron Man 3, you're going to see that theme come up again.
I think that's a good point about regret. And I think if you'd approached the most recent Star Wars trilogies different, you could have done the same thing with Luke. You could have given him a much clearer motivation. Uh, where, he has sort of a vague sense that he didn't train Kylo Ren right. And, as a result, he turned. But you could have made that sharper still, if basically, it was the family relationship that, caused, him to go south. And I could see Luke in that situation saying, I don't want there to be any more Skywalkers. I don't want to train any more Jedi ever, because nothing but bad is going to come from this. I think that's there in the trilogy, but I think you could have made it sharper still.
So, one other point about Iron Man, and I wanted you to be aware that they went into that shooting of that movie without a working script.
Seriously.
So, yeah, and they started this whole empire that they've got at this point by just committing to this,
playing around.
yeah, and committing to a C-list character, because Iron Man was never one of their A-listers, and just we don't know what we're doing. We're just gonna make a movie, and we're gonna see what happens.
Because what happened is, unfortunately for Marvel, they had a turn of the millennium. They had gotten into close to bankruptcy. They were not far away from going under completely. So through the ages, they had sold the movie rights to everybody from Spider-Man to the X-Men to the Incredible Hulk to the Fantastic Four. So any major character everybody kind of sort of knew, they didn't control. So they're like, okay, let's make an Iron Man movie. Sure, let's go do it. And they were having to make it up as they went along. I mean, like, I don't even think that the famous post-credit Marvel scene that everybody knows happens now, that took people by surprise in 2008. Like, the first time people was like, when Nick Fury comes onto the screen and mentions the idea of an Avenger initiative, nothing had ever happened like that before, and everybody minds just blew.
So, this is a tangent to this whole Iron Man discussion. And it's what Britt and I have talked about, where even though I have not seen a lot of, I've seen 3, now I've seen 5, but before I'd only seen 3 Marvel movies, never really read Marvel comic books. But still, when Scarlett Johansson comes on screen, it's like, oh yeah, Black Widow, and I know who Nick Fury is. I know these names still ring true. It's like, I still don't understand, like, people who go through society without. Brian, I was telling this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, that Brittany was they're talking about different archetypes and things like that. And just, I can't remember, she had a picture of Chewbacca on a slide, and all the kids went, oh, it's Bigfoot. And it's like, how do you not, or, people who don't know the line, even if it's the wrong line, Luke, I am your father, people who don't know even though you might not like Star Wars, you might not like Marvel, but you still have a social awareness of these names. Like, okay, that's a comic book thing, or okay, that's, so, I could, it was, I could still make those connections. But yeah, so are you guys suggesting then Iron Man 3 is next? Is that what's on the list?
No.
Oh, no.
No, next has to be Thor.
Thor, that's right.
Thor, and then Captain America, the First Avenger.
I agree with that.
Yeah, Iron Man 2 at the post credits was the Thor hammer. So.
Mm-hmm. Because what happens is, and this is one of the interesting things that Marvel does that everybody's tried to copy in the last decade, has been they use their individual character movies to build the characters and their individual personalities, get you to know them. And then all these movies will converge in an Avengers movie. So you get a bit of an introduction to all the characters in the Avengers movie, but you don't get into the depth of those characters at that point. It kind of, it's a neat trick that allows you to go, okay, if you somehow missed the Thor movie, well, you're gonna get an introduction of who Thor is in Avengers. But if you saw the Thor movie, you get a bigger understanding of who he is and where he's coming from.
So you've seen the South Park episode where they're developing their whole superhero gang, and they're plotting out, okay, you'll have your Netflix series at this point, then we'll have a big, yeah, they just rip on Marvel on that one. It was hilarious. Anyway,
I mean, it's become it became the thing that everybody in Hollywood wanted to do, and it shows how hard it is.
But it also shows what that collaboration and having one person kind of in charge and
Kevin Feige.
herding the cats, because it can be done. That's what Star Wars was missing, was this, again, in the sequel trilogy, it's just that coordination of, because you can have all these different stories and they can fit together just fine as long as you have one person, like I said, just playing Ranger on it. So
I'd be interested to see how the next two movies go for you, because the Thor or the Iron Man movies were very grounded in reality. They kind of had more of a Batman kind of feel to them in that sense, the Christopher Nolan Batman. And they came out about the same time, and so that makes sense. That's why part of the reason, that's part of the reason they went the route that they did. But I'll be interested to see how Thor in particular you feel about that one, because it's a drastic departure and it's a major risk that they had to take to try to make it work and fit with everything else. So
I survived Aquaman and I enjoyed Aquaman, so I'm sure Thor will be okay.
I will say too, though, that Thor is the character in the MCU who develops the most over the course of everything. He's really interesting.
And one other thing I would add to that is pay attention to the casting, because I think that's been the number one most successful thing that Marvel has done. They found every time, it seems, they get the right actor for the role.
They nail it every time. You're right. That's a really good point.
Oh yeah. And they get good actors. I mean, you look, for example, at Jeff Bridges in Iron Man, or you look at Sam Rockwell in Iron Man 2. I mean, or Samuel L. Jackson in all of them. I mean, they get people who are really, really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
So before we wrap this up, Brian, I don't think I've told you this story, because you just mentioned just what you said, just reminded me of it. So Fredo and Dave and we have a friend, Alan, and Alan got a text message. This is back in January. Got a message from this lady that said, "Hey, do you want to join my mom and me for lunch at Commander's Palace on February 18th?" And Commander's Palace is big, schwanky. Have either of you been to Commander's Palace before?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you drop a dime there. But anyway, and
the
Alan
service is impeccable.
And
the valet is less.
Yeah, the valet told me to F off. But anyway, so Alan lives in Baton Rouge, and he was like, "Man, I've always wanted to go to Commander's Palace." He said, "But I'd have to, I'd have to take, day off, and to make it down there, blah blah blah." He said, "Let me get back to you." And the next morning, like at 7:30, the lady texts back and says, "Well, it's a shame that you can't come to Commander's Palace with us, because Samuel L. Jackson's going to be joining us. He's a friend of my mom's." And Alan's like, "Way to bury the lead. I mean, don't you think you would say, hey," I mean, he's like, "Well, I'll take a day of vacation for that. Seat's already been filled." So Alan could have had lunch at Commander's Palace with Samuel L. Jackson. And meanwhile, I was thinking, well, maybe I should stand outside Commander's Palace with my Mace Windu figure and have him sign it, because I'd have Samuel L. Jackson sign that bad MFer, on a big Mace Windu figure. So
gumbo may taste like pumpkin pie, but I ain't eating it.
There you go. And I think that's the perfect ending to this podcast for this week. So I want to thank my brother for joining us. And it was awesome. Thanks for joining. I hope you had fun. Yeah, for everybody else, we'll see you next week. We'll obviously be talking about Thor and then whatever else, other Star Wars things we got going on. So with that, we'll say who dat?
Who dat?
Do that.
And everybody take her easy.
McConkey.